Hello, and thank you for joining us for the University of St. Francis Lecture Series, a virtual program of the Allen County Public Library. Today's program is entitled The Mental Health and Wellness of Today's Students. My name is Mark Eber. I'm the Assistant Manager of the Aboite Branch Library, and I will be the host for today's program. This program is being recorded. In order to improve the quality of everyone's listening experience, your microphones have been muted. If you have a question or comment, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. We will use chat to facilitate a question and answer session at the end of the program. The purpose of the USF Lecture Series is to present topics of interest and research information to the residents of Allen County, and to provide a platform for the faculty members of USF to share their passion for their subjects with our patrons. This evening we are pleased to have two presenters. First, Dr. Monica Heller, Assistant Professor of Psychology at the University of St. Francis. Dr. Heller is an educational psychologist. Her research primarily investigates person-oriented emotional, cognitive, and behavioral factors that hinder student success and effective strategies that support student academic resilience, persistence, and achievement. Dr. Michael Martynowicz is Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of St. Francis. He is also an educational psychologist. With an emphasis in human development and learning, he researches students' achievement motivation, cognitive self-regulation, selection and use of learning strategies, and mental health issues that impact academic performance and behavior. Would you first please welcome Dr. Monica Heller?
Thank you, Mark. Hi, I'm Dr. Monica Heller, and I am very excited to be here with my colleague, Dr. Mike Martynowicz. We're researchers at heart, and so that's one of the reasons that we are here tonight, so we can present you with a lot of information on this topic. The other reason why we're very passionate about this topic is, you know, in recent years, we've becoming more alarmed by some of the things that we're seeing and the trends that are going on with the youth of today, especially in terms of this topic of mental health and well-being. So, you know, as professors, college educators, advisors to college students, but we're also parents, this is a topic that is very close to our hearts. To start us off, we thought it would be very interesting to get you all thinking about some statements that we hear commonly out there, or headlines we see in the news, or even maybe some personal beliefs that you might actually have or hold about youth when it comes to mental health or mental illness. And so we'd like to start off here with some truth or myth statements to kind of test your knowledge a little bit and educate you further in some of these areas. All right, so our first one here: young people do not or cannot have mental health problems. Well, I think Dr. Martynowicz and I would not be here tonight if that was something that was a true statement. And in fact, it absolutely is a myth. What we're finding out there through work with youth, even young children, you know, 4, 5, 6 years old, that mental health problems can be an issue with children and in their families. And what's really interesting here is if we look at the World Health Organization and some information that they have gathered, that half, and I repeat, half of all the people who are diagnosed with mental health disorders showed symptoms before the age of 14. So we're talking about older adolescents, young adults who may have already been exhibiting some of these signs and symptoms early on. And hindsight's 2020. Here we know that potentially if we could have been more aware or noticed some of these signs, we might have been able to make a difference. All right, let's go on to our next one. Truth or myth? Children will grow out of their mental health problems. Or we also hear people say it's just a phase. All right, that actually is also a myth. True experiences or challenges with mental health are not simply something that's very fleeting, or it's not something that just occurs within, 1 or 2 days or a week and then it's just kind of over and gone. What we find is, and I'll be talking about some of these criteria that we look at later on, but what we find is many of the problems that we're talking about today, they were persistent. They were chronic, and it wasn't something that they could just simply grow out of or was fleeting. So one of the reasons why we want to think about this, and especially early on, is because the mental health issues that are not addressed in childhood, if they are not addressed, they can lead into very serious mental health problems on down the road. It could lead to substance use issues where individuals may be trying to self-medicate to try to address anxiety that they might be experiencing or depressive symptoms that they're experiencing. The other thing that we know too through research on the biology bases of mental illness and about development in our youth is that a lot of these struggles that they're having are rooted in biology, either in our neurochemistry or the functioning of certain brain structures. We know that those also don't just simply go away. They could be there for a long period of time or could have been around very early on and we just were not paying much attention to or drawing attention to addressing these in the youth. We also know developmentally in adolescents, they're more susceptible to experiencing the effects of depression and anxiety at heightened levels compared to other individuals in other age groups. All right, let's take a look at another one. Adolescents today have nothing to be depressed or anxious about. Now, we're going to get into the discussion a little bit later on about what's been going on in this last year related to COVID-19 and the pandemic. But if we think about this, and this is a myth, all right, if you really think about it, we compare generations of past to generations today, all right, no group of youth are ever really exempt from experiencing mental health problems. Even though we say kids these days, or back when I was young, right, we've heard those before. Children, youth in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, they also had their own stressors. They also had various things that might contribute to some signs and symptoms of depression. So today's youth really is not exempt from that. But if you also look at today's time, the role of technology, social media, and so forth, there are also very unique stressors and factors that have exacerbated a lot of the problems, mental health challenges that our youth are facing. And as I said, even more so in this past year. And as I mentioned, with adolescents and their developing brain, they're far more susceptible to so many of these other things that will exacerbate a lot of these symptoms and signs. Let's take a look at another one. Youth claiming to have depression are just making excuses. They're lazy, and they should just get over it. All right. Well, this also is a myth, and I think you're starting to see a pattern here. All right. What we know about depressive symptoms is the symptoms themselves may make it look like an adolescent is very lazy, they're unmotivated, and so forth. But that is actually what is going on within them, and even biologically. It is typical for them to have low energy. It is typical for them to have low motivation, just purely from the experience of depression, either clinically in the brain or situationally, emotionally, and so forth. All right. So those types of things, low energy, can contribute to the fact that it's very hard for them to find the motivation to get up and do things, to be productive, to complete tasks. So it may come across as being very lazy, but there's a difference in that and what's going on and the actual voluntary choice to not do things. What we know in individuals who are challenged with depression, anxiety, and so forth is they cannot simply just will themselves to overcome it or will themselves to have energy, to feel better, to find joy, and so forth. Now, we also know that an outcome, all right, a possible outcome of depressive symptoms, anxiety, high stress can also be suicide, another very serious topic. Here is one. Most youth who attempt suicide do not show any signs prior to the attempt. That is also not true, not founded in terms of research. In most cases, there are often multiple red flags that are present prior to that attempt. And again, in this case, it really is sad when hindsight is 20/20 for us to think about, after that experience, did we notice that there were any changes in our adolescent or in the young child? Did we notice that they weren't eating or sleeping in the same patterns that they were before? Did we see a change in their mood? Whereas there for a while they were very joyous and had and demonstrated happiness and pleasure in activities, but then recently there was a dramatic change there. Or, expressing feelings of self-worth or hopelessness, withdrawing or isolating from family and friends when normally they would reach out to or engage with those same family and friends. Physical ailments, actually stomach aches, headaches, bodily pains can be signs of depression, anxiety, and could lead someone to potentially contemplate suicide. And then also changes in their approaches to things in their daily lives, such as the school environment, maybe if they have extracurricular jobs, engagement with friends, and so forth. And some of the more obvious one, writing, talking, drawing about death or suicide, giving away possessions. In some cases, individuals, if they have things that are of value to them, they may want to make sure that those things are taken care of. All right, so they may start giving away things that are very precious to them, or they want to make sure that that things are addressed when they are gone. And also another predictor could be major life changes or transitions or events. So the loss of a parent, divorce of parents, changing schools or moving away. Those kinds of things can also be precursors to a possible suicide attempt. So it's something that we definitely need to pay close attention to. Any kind of changes or anything that might be a major transition for them that could preempt something like that. Here's our last one. If we openly talk about youth suicide, it will make them more likely to attempt it. And once again, this is an absolute myth, very completely unfounded. Openly talking, openly asking our youth, inquiring about how are you feeling? Have you been having these thoughts? That is not something that's going to facilitate a suicide attempt or make it more likely. In fact, what we find that avoiding that discussion could be something that may be a precursor to an actual attempt. Avoiding it does not show an adolescent that they are welcome to talk about some of these thoughts and feelings that they're having. It doesn't show that they can feel free to come to an adult about such things. So being able to openly discuss it gives them the tools in how to be able to get help or talk to someone when they're really struggling with this and they may be calling out for help. All right, so now we've set the stage, all right, hopefully got ourselves thinking more accurately about some of these statements. And now I want to help educate you on a few key things to be looking for to determine if your youth may be struggling with mental health. All right, so we're going to be going over some of the major signs and then also looking at some statistics that we have to this point about youth mental health in general. These 4 criteria, these are the general broad criteria that most mental health professionals are going to be utilizing in determining if this behavior, this emotional state, these thoughts that they're expressing, if this is something that is just some normal or typical, or if we need to take further note of and investigate this further. All right, so when we look at this, we tend to look at behaviors and thoughts, physiological or the body responses, and emotional states. We look to see, are they happening too frequently, or are they happening at such an intense level compared to what is normal for most of us in the human experience? So for example, it's normal for us to be sad. You know, if you watch a movie or you go to a funeral, you know, you've lost someone close in your family. That is very normal to be sad and to be tearful. But when it is something that is happening on a frequent, chronic basis, days upon days, weeks upon weeks, with no real relief, then that is now starting to venture into that arena of too frequent or too intense. Same way with anxiety. I mean, it's very normal for us to be nervous about a paper that's coming up or a presentation, or it's normal for us to be nervous about maybe driving for the first time. But when it's happening at such an intense level that you are shaking, you're overwhelmed, and you feel as if you're about ready to pass out, then that's something where it's taking it beyond the human experience. Number two, when it's outside the norm for the situation or the culture or the society that you're living in. So we understand that there are certain situations where it's normal to be sad or tearful, and I just gave an example of that. It's also normal in certain situations for us to wash our hands, right? Especially now during this pandemic, we're encouraged to wash our hands frequently. But when we're talking about certain situations where I'm extremely anxious, I can't even walk out of my house, I can't go to my car because I'm shaking, I cannot drive my car because I am so worried, those situations typically do not warrant someone to just naturally be nervous. So when someone is reacting in such a way or thinking certain thoughts of worthlessness or helplessness or I'm a failure, when it's not really a situation that makes sense, then that again is where we want to look a little bit more closely at this. Number three is a big one. When the person is experiencing such significant emotional distress that they are considering harming themselves or maybe even harming others. So the sadness that they're feeling, the anxiety that they're feeling is so overwhelming, it is extremely tormenting them, and it is mental and emotional anguish. That again is a sign that we might want to look into that a little bit further. And number four really is a key for us to look at. Experiencing these things, having these thoughts, engaging in these behaviors, or lack of behaviors that we typically should be engaging in, such as showering, eating correctly, or routinely, and so forth. When those things are getting in the way of us living a functioning daily life, when we are not being productive or being able to engage in just normal functions of our daily life, then again, that's another sign that this is a little bit more than just something typical in our human experience. All right, so we have these four general broad criteria that we take a look at. Now let's take a look a little bit further at specific signs of depression, anxiety, and stress. Now I know you can't see the specific measure up there. It's the DAS-21. It stands for Depression, Anxiety, Stress Scale, but it's something that is rather commonly used. In fact, Dr. Martynowicz and I used it in a study that we recently conducted with our freshman students at St. Francis. But it is a really good indicator of 7 different features within each of these categories to try to help us identify, are there specific concerns in any of these areas? Are students or are youth reporting that these are occurring in their lives, and especially recently? All right, so when we look at the DAS, and I'm just going to read off a couple of these just to give you an idea. But for depression, we look at someone who might say, you know, I don't seem to experience any positive feelings at all. I find it difficult to work up the initiative to do things. I feel I have nothing to look forward to. I feel downhearted and blue. I feel as if it wasn't I'm not worth much as a person, or that my life doesn't have meaning. These are all very clear signs that this is someone who might be struggling with depression. All right. In terms of anxiety, here are some features that you might be on the lookout for. Someone who says, I have trouble falling or staying asleep because my mind is just going. Little things start to irritate me. I lose focus easily and can't concentrate. I feel out of control or helpless. I have trouble relaxing. I feel exhausted, or I start to worry about everything. All right, those are some signs and symptoms of anxiety. With anxiety, you have physiological, the heart racing, the sweating, tremors, headache, stomach ache, but you also have cognitive or thinking signs that correlate with anxiety. And then as far as stress, I felt that I was using a lot of nervous energy. I tend to overreact to certain situations. I feel overwhelmed. I have trouble winding down. I am intolerant or impatient or easily irritated by things that get in the way of my productivity. There are many, many more. And I encourage you, you can go out and take a look at this. This instrument is out there, not for self-diagnosis or anything, but it does give you a good idea of some signs and symptoms to be on the lookout for. The other thing that we want to be taking a look at is people's vulnerability to stress. A lot of times we are engaging in certain things or don't have certain skill sets that are going to help us manage stress. And that can, again, lead to being very overwhelmed and lead into further mental health illness problems. So a few things, Parkview Behavioral Health has this wonderful tool that you can use to estimate how vulnerable are you to stress. And this can be used with youth. It's very easy. But a few of the things it's looking at is, do you allow yourself downtime, all right? Or are you isolated, alone? Are you using substances, so alcohol, nicotine, tobacco, illicit drugs? Do you not have connections with others or meaningful relationships? Poor eating or sleeping habits? A lot of these things make us far more susceptible to stress. And again, it makes it very difficult for us to manage maybe some of these other signs and symptoms that could lead into serious mental illness. So why is this all important for us to consider? All right. The thing is, many youth are at risk based upon a lot of the symptoms I was just reading, or a lot of those things that they don't really have in place to be able to handle stress. And we also have a number of youth who are actually dealing with mental illness. All right, let's take a look at some recent statistics. Now I want to draw your attention to this. The CDC, the Centers for Disease and Control, 2020, all right, these are statistics that were reported in 2020. This was pre-COVID-19 pandemic. Mental health problems are on the rise in children ages 3 to 17. Each year there are new diagnoses of children, 7.4% with behavioral problems, 7.1% with an anxiety disorder, 3.2% with depression. Each year. This does not include the number of children or adolescents who were diagnosed prior to who may still be struggling with those same issues. And again, as it says here, how many are also undiagnosed? So these numbers are actually estimated to be lower than the anticipated number of youth who are struggling with these very issues. Here's another set. U.S. Department of Health and Human Services 2020, again, pre-pandemic. Anxiety disorders, those who are 13 to 18 years old, 32% diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. Depression, 13%. ADHD, 9%. Eating disorders, lower, but still there, 3%. And suicide is the second leading cause of death in those 15 to 24-year-olds, right behind accidents. Substance use and abuse. By the time they reach 12th grade, half of adolescents have misused some illicit drug at least once, and marijuana is the most common one that's utilized. So again, this is something that is becoming more problematic for our youth, something that warrants more attention. As I mentioned, these statistics are pre-pandemic. I just wanted to share an article, a few snippets from it with you here. And I know, again, you can't see the article provided there. It's titled, "The Pandemic Has Researchers Worried About Teen Suicide." This just came out a couple months ago. The CDC conducted a study, and the results of that study revealed that anxiety and depression symptoms in teens are up sharply since this past March. All right, I think that's understandable, okay? So if we think about those numbers, though, that were pre-pandemic that I was just showing you in the previous slide, now add a magnifier to those. Again, more cause for us to take some pause and start trying to address this issue. Emergency room and hotline calls for these issues rose dramatically in the last 9 months. So not only are we seeing a rise in symptoms, but these symptoms must be significant enough for people to be calling in to these hotlines, seeking help, seeking guidance, and so forth. And then the last one, 11% of all respondents to that survey or that study, and then if you capture just one particular age group here, the 18 to 24-year-olds, 1 in 4, 25%, reported seriously considering suicide recently. So again, it's something that really warrants our attention, something that we need to take a look at further. So now we're seeing this all a lot more clearly, and I've given you a little bit more information as a means to lay a really good foundation in understanding just youth mental health in general. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Martynowicz, who's now going to take us into this arena of thinking about the students and how all of this then plays a role with that particular population.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you tonight. So, as Dr. Heller stated, it's one thing to consider these issues in light of people trying to function on a daily basis, right? Complete basic daily tasks, communicate with family members and friends, hold relationships. It's another to consider people who are also trying to function within an academic setting and not just complete their work, but be able to think clearly, be able to communicate clearly. This imposes a whole new set of problems that we need to be aware of. So we're going to go through some numbers, and I just want to reiterate what Dr. Heller mentioned. While we're looking at very recent data here in the past couple of years for the most part, it is pre-COVID data. And I know you've heard that from Dr. Heller a couple times, but I need to state it as well because these numbers are problematic enough on their own when you take that into account. So first of all, over the past decade, there's been a massive increase, 71% according to NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, and the APA, in terms of people experiencing what they would call serious psychological distress within the past 30 days. Now, that's an important marker because when you consider diagnoses that people can typically incur, whether it's thinking about depression, whether it's stuff related to PTSD, or even various anxiety disorders, 30 days tends to be a good marker. I mean, typically, if someone is struggling with something within the last 30 days, and especially if it's been going on for about a 30-day period, that's usually something we can look to as being something we need to pay attention to. Whereas if it's something more acute or something we don't need to be as concerned about, a lot of times it'll drop off within that time frame. So that's important to understand. It's also important to understand that just generally speaking, there's been a rise in these issues amongst today's college students specifically. And I think this is relevant to point out because it's one thing to talk about today's college students, but you might think, well, okay, a lot of people don't go to college. That's true. So what we're really saying is people in the 4-ish years post-high school, these are the issues they're dealing with, whether they're going to college, whether they're serving our country, whether they're going into the workforce, whatever it is they're doing, these are issues that they're dealing with. And they are rising, not just now, but they're rising more than they have with prior groups of young people. So it's not like there's this typical normal trajectory in the data that we see that you would anticipate and be able to say, well, this is common amongst people this age. It's really not. We're seeing jumps that are beyond the norm. This statistically are different than what we've seen in the past. So some numbers to look at here. 80% of students report feeling overwhelmed by school responsibilities. Now you might think, well, okay, of course they're going to say that. School can be overwhelming, but you've got to dive a little deeper into that. You've got to ask yourself why. I mean, that's a big number, right? You've got to ask yourself why. Well, there are some reasons behind that number that we know that are rooted in the research. First of all, today's students have more things going on outside of school than what we traditionally saw in previous generations of college students. Now, if anyone's watching and you did college in the past, this isn't meant to be a slam on your experience because everyone works very hard. There's a reason why the degrees matter, right? You work hard for them. But the reality is today's students are more likely to not only have a job, to not only possibly have multiple jobs, to not only possibly have their own family they're caring for, and potentially even be helping their parents or guardians out with bills and things like that as well. So today's students have, and we're not suggesting that prior students didn't have these responsibilities. What we're saying is more students today have them than they did in the past. More students have extra moderate to large scale stressors to deal with outside of the classroom. 50% of students attribute their anxiety and stress to struggles in school specifically. So you might look at that and think, well, okay, so they've got these stressors happening outside of the classroom, but then boy, it seems like being in school is really contributing to that. But you've got to stop and ask yourself, why? Right? And the reason why, I keep going back to this, sorry, but is because these students have so much more on their plate that the notion of being in school and taking all that on is paramount. I mean, anecdotally, and Dr. Heller could share similar thoughts, the number of students that I talk to that are in my classes or in advising roles that, sure, we might be talking about an assignment for my class or a paper they're working on or something they need help with, but we wind up talking about, they're taking on an extra 10 to 20 hours at work because they're helping mom or dad or their grandma pay the bills, or they had to miss class not because they were being lazy or wanted to miss class, but because they needed to stay home and watch one of their siblings that night because mom picked up an extra shift at work. I mean, these students are dealing with things that we don't think about. And Dr. Heller did a really great job of laying this out earlier, but it's so easy to think, well, maybe these students are being lazy or maybe they need to pull out of it. But in reality, there's a lot more happening. 27% report feeling lonely most of the time, 24% report having no one to talk to. And I don't want to foreshadow too much, but that's particularly interesting given that society has this perception that young people have all kinds of communication outlets, right, that social media allows for all these possibilities for young people. And, really they kind of have no excuse, right, to not have people to talk to. But the data bears out differently. The data suggests that a good number of these students, they don't feel like they have anyone to talk to. And social media and things like that, even instant messaging, texting, doesn't really mediate that at all. So some more things to jump into here. Now, what's interesting is, not positively, but interesting, is that the numbers we see here on a national scale are reflected locally as well. Dr. Heller earlier referred to a study she and I just conducted last year, and I can tell you we saw similar numbers in our study. And when you look at studies across the country and when you really get into the literature on this topic, you see this everywhere. And I think that's important to note because it's very common for us to go, well, okay, I know that might be an issue nationally, but for us or in our community or on our campus or whatever it is, it's probably not that bad. These numbers are prevalent everywhere. 1 in 3 students worldwide report having a mental health disorder. 57% of female and 40% of male students report experiencing overwhelming anxiety in the last year. 33% of females, 27% of males report having a period of feeling so depressed it was difficult to function. And again, go back to what Dr. Heller said earlier, that's an important component. That's one of those 4 primary criteria between deciding if somebody's just a little sad or if they have depression. If somebody is just kind of a neat freak or if they're dealing with OCD. If somebody is just kind of struggling with a loss or traumatic event or if they have PTSD. One of those 4 criteria is their ability to function on a daily basis. In relationships, occupationally, at school, socially, is it impacted? Are they not functioning in the ways they typically would? So those numbers are relevant. 25 to 33% meet the criteria for an anxiety or depressive disorder at some point during their college experience. That's a range provided, but most of the literature suggests it's closer to that 33% marker, which means practically, so the first class I teach tomorrow has, I think, 18 students in it. On average, 6 of the students in that class then, sometime during their college experience, are going to meet the criteria for an anxiety or depressive disorder. Those are big numbers. 1 in 3 report having considered suicide in the past 12 months. Now this is one that sometimes people bristle at because it's so uncomfortable. I know Dr. Heller mentioned it earlier, but I think it's important to note that we're seeing this number specifically in college students or in college age students as well. Because what it tells us is that this issue is bigger than we think it is. It's very easy to kind of brush it off, or like I said earlier, suggest that maybe this is an issue nationally, sure, but we have a program here. There are things that we do in our community. And everybody across the nation says those things. Everybody thinks these things don't really impact their community or their school, but they do. 1 in 3 reporting having considered suicide in the past 12 months for people ages 18, 19, 20, 21. That's a big number, and it's important to be cognizant of it. 20% of students report having experienced 3 or more ACEs. Now, I need to talk about this for just a minute. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. If you're watching this presentation, my guess is you might know what ACEs are, but just in case you don't, this refers to things that people might have experienced when they were younger, such as having a parent that committed a crime and went to jail, such as experiencing abuse. There's a list of 10 ACEs factors, and essentially what the research over time has found is the more adverse childhood experiences that someone has had as a child, there are all these other problematic outcomes later in life. Typically, if they've had 3 or more, that usually tends to be the marker where we see increases in substance abuse as an adult. You can even stretch it to greater likelihood they're going to experience divorce. There's a multitude of factors you could look at. So 20% of students reporting having 3 or more of those, I mean, that's 1 in 5. Again, that's big. So what are some vulnerability factors? What are some things we need to really keep in mind when we think about what might be driving some of the numbers that Dr. Heller and I have talked about tonight? Well, the transition out of high school and into college or the workforce, or again, if the military, if they're going to serve our country, is a big one. And Dr. Heller did a great job of addressing this earlier, but I want to bring it back up. We live in a society that tends to say things like, well, these young people just need to pull up their bootstraps, right? They just need to be tough. That's what we did. And we tend to have this hindsight bias when we're thinking about our own experience, and it tends to be very self-serving, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, in the sense that we tend to not always remember exactly what our experience was. We tend to remember how we wished it was or how we had hoped it would have been. And in reality, the transition from high school to college is tough, especially when you consider that the number of transitions that can invoke anxiety or stress, like Dr. Heller spoke about earlier, that people are experiencing prior to age 18 are up in today's youth. Examples of transitions are things like divorce, moving, serious relationships that might fail. I mean, there's a multitude of factors. There are more kids working now than previously, and the jobs they're holding having more responsibility for things like assisting with family bills and family income, you start throwing all this into a pot. The transition out of high school to post-high school, whatever that post-high school experience looks like. We're focusing on college tonight, but again, could be military, could be work. That transition is tougher for today's generation. They have more going on. And that's not something that we're saying to make that up or for headlines. It bears out in the data. When experiencing challenges in college, 40% of students don't seek help or they avoid help when offered. This is based on 2018 and 19 data from NAMI and from the APA, from the American Psychological Association. This is a huge number. When we consider the data that Dr. Heller shared earlier, and then some of the things I just shared out a few minutes ago, you consider 2 in 5 won't seek help even when it's offered, and that even when it's offered is key. So I'll give an example. What'll happen, say, on a college campus is resources are available to students, right? There are counselors they can go see. It's anonymous, it's confidential. I know at USF we have those services for our students, and they're great. They're really good services. And the university will send information out about the services, and students can access them. But what we're saying is 40% of the students that have these issues, at least 40%, won't seek help. Even when it's free, it's anonymous, it's confidential, it's there, they won't seek the help. Which means merely offering the programs, which merely offering the services, even marketing them, isn't enough. It's not enough. And this is where that butts up against what Dr. Heller was saying earlier and what I reiterated a few minutes ago about us having that, well, people need to tough it out, they need to pull up the bootstraps mentality. Clearly that's not enough, right? When people are experiencing some of the issues that Dr. Heller so eloquently laid out earlier, and still 40% of them, that's not enough to get them to step forward, right? That says something about the stigma involving mental health. It should tell us something about how comfortable people feel about seeking help. And it should probably make us want to do more than just offer services, right? Less than 20% of youth with diagnosable mental health problems receive the treatment they need. Also a big number for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. So now we have to get into contributors to mental health disorders. So obviously, some of these things could be genetic, and it very much depends on the type of disorder and issue that you're talking about. Frankly, that's a whole separate talk. That's a whole separate conversation to have. Also, we could have hormonal imbalances in neurotransmitters, and of course, we could be looking at things like traumatic brain injuries or TBI or various malfunctions as a result of that. Also, psychological contributors. Things like negative thoughts, students that have a very harsh inner critic, low self-worth, high pressure or perfectionism. In fact, that's usually kind of something that mirrors anxiety or stress. That's a very common way for students to deal with anxiety and stress, is to kind of form it into a perfectionist tendencies. Constant worry or stress, and especially how they might deal with stress. And then social and environmental contributors. The climate of the school they're in matters. Social media, which, you know, it's funny, there's a lot of, this is a whole separate talk too, but society tends to believe that social media provides this outlet for people to be able to communicate, and that it allows you to stay in touch with people, right? You can see pictures of their dogs, and it's this really positive thing, but in reality, a lot of the research is bearing out that, at least for our young people, social media is not a good thing. It's very divisive, and the more they're on it, the more likely they are to deal with some of these mental health issues. So social media is a big one. Of course, the home environment and support system is really big. Whether that's biological family or friends or teachers or coworkers, support system is a big deal. And then, of course, social conditions such as poverty and potentially issues involving prejudice or discrimination. So short and long-term consequences. All of this can result in many potential negative outcomes. And I've already foreshadowed this a little bit, but relationship problems, high absenteeism, whether it's school or work, behavioral issues in school, potentially delinquent behavior, lower achievement, greater chance they're going to drop out of high school, greater chance they're not going to persist and finish their college degree. You know, a very hot issue right now for colleges and universities is retention, right? These students come, but then such a high percentage don't finish. Why? These factors play a large role in that. Also greater likelihood of physical illness and poor mental health overall, which of course there's a reciprocal relationship between those two things. So like Dr. Heller said earlier, a lot of these data we looked at tonight are pre-COVID, right? So what do you think are some of the main psychological, biological, and social challenges faced by students today, especially when you kind of take COVID into account? There's a lot of things we could discuss here, but there's really 5 we're going to focus on. Time management, or their ability to cognitively self-regulate. So this gets into, if a student knows they have an exam coming up, do they set a study plan for how and when they're going to study and what they're going to do? Do they actually follow the plan? Do they keep track of how they go about studying? After they take the exam, do they reflect upon what they did? Do they allow that to potentially inform how they prepare for the next exam? These types of skills are being greatly impacted or diminished. Changes in motivation. Dr. Heller mentioned this earlier, but this is a big one post-COVID as well that we're seeing. Decreased social support system. And you can think about that in 2 ways. One, of course, COVID has forced us all to socially withdraw, which is really problematic because we're social animals by nature. We're designed that way and we function that way. And when someone is having a mental health issue, when someone is struggling with something, that's one of the first things we look at, right? Are they starting to socially withdraw? Are they starting to pull away from friends and family and coworkers? And if so, that's a red flag. Well, here, with COVID, we're being forced to socially isolate. But then you also take into account that not only is there this forced social isolation, but we're seeing that people are kind of doing it to themselves as well. Even when they have opportunities to go out and do things, they may not be doing it. Their energy is low. Their patterns are off. They may not have the same schedule with work. Routine is, we function based on routine. And so all these changes are leading to disruptions in people's support systems. Potential decrease in financial resources. Of course, this is huge for some people. It's very much dependent upon the situation they're in. And then not just that we socially withdraw, but especially the impact of it on academics and our general well-being. Because we're such social creatures. So these are factors that we're seeing as a result of COVID that are kind of magnified by it in a sense. So what are some things we can do to promote mental health and wellness, particularly in our young people, particularly this post-high school population? Some of these are things that we would usually say anyway, but so much more important now based on what we know in the research in terms of how these types of strategies can combat the types of problems we've been talking about tonight that people have. Prioritizing health-promoting behaviors. People need sleep. And this one isn't always easy because like I said, so many of our students now have so many responsibilities outside of the classroom. They may not be able to get the proper sleep. But when they can, they need to. Even upwards into people's early 20s, they need an average of 8 hours to optimally function at a proper cognitive level. Exercise and nutrition are always huge. And having hobbies, having fun things to do, which again, it's so funny because COVID has given us some free time in some respects where we've kind of had to have time on our own or only with our families, but people aren't necessarily taking advantage of that. Well, engaging in hobbies, having fun things to do is really important, and doing things that people enjoy. Building a positive support system, utilizing technology to do so. Regulating use of social media. Again, if people are on social media too much, we see problems there. Reaching out to others who may be at risk, and seeking help if you or someone you know is struggling. Again, taking that step to reach out, which is why for you, if there's someone that you know that you think is struggling with some of the issues that we've talked about tonight, being there for them, listening to them, encouraging them to reach out to someone is important. You may be the catalyst that gets them to help because again, 40% of people aren't going to reach out on their own. Call to action, recognize COVID's impact. We can't continue to inherently dismiss these things as weakness in today's youth. It's not weakness. We have to understand these are real legitimate issues. We need to consider the mental health resources that are available in our community, especially for students in poverty-stricken areas, especially for students in low SES areas where resources may be more scant anyway. And then adopting proactive versus reactive approaches. Considering what we could do to help these students in advance versus just reacting after the problems have occurred. And then as far as educators are concerned, we have to pay attention to students who are quiet and disengaged, who have trouble focusing, who are absent a lot. Maybe they procrastinate. Maybe they don't respond to communications. You know, there's this thing in psychology, specifically in social psychology, referred to as the fundamental attribution error, which basically says that if someone does something we don't like or that we don't approve of, we're very prone to assume it's something internal about the person, that it might be something wrong with them at their core, and we might fail to consider external factors that might be driving that. And the fundamental attribution error is an error that we typically make as humans. It's very common, and the biggest way to combat it is to be cognizant of it. So the biggest thing I would challenge, not just educators, but anyone working with young people, parents, whatever, is to stop and ask yourself, when you see a young person doing something that might be counterproductive for them, ask yourself why they might be behaving that way. What might be happening externally that might be causing that behavior? And don't just assume it's something about the student or the person themselves. And then to end, we have some local resources which will be on the document for anyone that wants to look at them. I'll just click through there. And that's the thing, there are so many resources out there for these kids. They just need to know where they are and need somebody to connect them. If you have comments or questions, feel free to email Dr. Heller or I at any time. And we just want to call out Devin Harple. She's a grad student at USF. She was our graduate assistant last year and involved in some of this research, and she did an excellent job, and we just want to thank her for all that she did. And I think now we are at Q&A, right, Mark?
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Martynowicz. If you have a question you'd like to ask or a comment you'd like to make, you can type it into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I will pass it on to the presenters. While you're doing that, I wanted to ask,
sure.
You talked about the 40% who never seek help, even if it's all around them.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a parent or a friend or a teacher or something like that, is there a better way to approach somebody who's resistant that might help, maximize the chances that they'll respond well?
Yeah, and I'd be curious to know how Dr. Heller would respond to this, but my response to that would be, those issues are usually about trust, and it's usually about the person feeling comfortable enough to come forward. And so a lot of times, if someone that's close to them, someone that they trust, reaches out to them and exposes them to a resource or offers to help them, that can oftentimes be the catalyst. So it may not be the person themselves that steps up, but if someone that they really trust, really have a lot of faith in, is encouraging them and is with them, I mean, you might have to walk with them. I've had a couple students over the years that I had a good enough relationship with that once they disclosed some things to me, I literally walked them to the campus counselor and said, look, I'm just going to go with you. Mm-hmm. Let's just, and that's what they needed. It was something as simple as that, someone they trusted to say, I'm going to go with you. So my advice to parents or people would be, don't overthink it, and this might be a hard one, but I'm just going to be real, and then I want to see what Dr. Heller has to say, but don't let your pride get in the way. So as a parent or guardian, if you're not the person, if you're not the catalyst that's going to get your child to seek help, but you think someone else might be, let that person do it. Because we do run into some of those issues, and I know you've probably seen some of this too, but sometimes parents will kind of feel like, well, it needs to be me, or their feelings will be hurt maybe if the child doesn't want them to be the person they talk to. If ultimately the goal is your child getting help, then it probably doesn't matter who it is that gets them there. So I would throw that in as well.
I think there's a couple things. I think one, it really is on how you approach the individual, your line of questioning, instead of saying, what's wrong with you, or what's more of, hey, what's going on? You seem a little different today. Can you tell me, how are things going? How you approach that line of questioning can really set them into the mode of either I'm going to be on defense and not trust you with being vulnerable, or I'm going to open up to you. And I would say the other thing is too, what they're finding with a lot of the research surrounding kind of suicide attempts and so forth, a lot of times it's our own fear of approaching and asking the person that holds us back, and the other individual, they may just be wanting someone to notice and to actually show an interest and not like give attention. But I know with some students, I have an assignment that they write about stressors and things like that. And it's almost like they were holding so much in.
Yeah.
And once finally someone showed they had care and concern and wanted to hear about them, the dam just broke open. And then they were more open to talking about what was going on.
Well, thank you. If anybody else has a question, please feel free. Otherwise, we will wrap it up for this evening. If you would like to see this lecture again or share it with someone you know, visit the Access Fort Wayne YouTube channel. It will be posted within about a week. While there, you can also access a variety of interesting and informative content produced by the staff at Access Fort Wayne. Please join us for the next University of St. Francis virtual lecture on Monday, February 22nd at 6:30 p.m. when Dr. Adam DeVille will present Removing Statues and Rewriting History, Lessons from the Byzantine Past Relevant to an American Future. If you are interested in that program and our other upcoming virtual programs for adults, children, and teens, please visit the Allen County Public Library website at www.acpl.info. You can find a comprehensive listing of events under the Events tab located near the top of the home page. Most of the events ask you to register in advance, so please take note of that. If you have any follow-up questions or comments regarding the information shared today or are in need of any additional resources, please contact us at ask@acpl.info. The staff there will forward your questions and comments to the appropriate personnel who will respond directly to you. On behalf of Dr. Heller and Dr. Martynowicz and the staff at Access Fort Wayne, thank you for attending this evening's program, and have a great evening.